This says that her internet's unstable, so she's going to keep her camera off.
Okay.
Brian, I know you were having some technical difficulties. If you want, Sharon and I can kick us off if you're having trouble.
Sure.
I can't see your face over the closed caption. There we go. Now I can.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So, John, I know you and I connected this morning about agenda, and I shared that we were hoping to start with a discussion about the provision on high turnover. And so that's our suggestion for where we'd like to start right now. We have a proposal ready, a counter that we're ready to talk you through.
Great.
Okay. Let me share screen, and then Sharon's going to be leading us through this.
Yes, this is actually a topic of a lot of interest for me. I think so I'm pleased that we are talking about it and putting some attention to it. Every employer understands that it is far more effective to retain employees and invest in employees. That's a far bigger yield for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish than it is to deal with high turnover, right? That's very costly to whatever. There's financial costs associated with that, but the bigger issue is it's much harder to implement anything you want to implement to accomplish anything you want to accomplish if your team keeps changing and keeps turning over, right? So large degree of interest in this. We also want to be really practical about what is the commitment and of implementing this. So what we looked at as we were looking through this proposal is, well, how many schools do we have that have more than 15% turnover? That seemed like a pretty good place to start. And our team spent I believe it was 10 hours because data is not, you would think that data would turn around on a dime, but it does not. It's really pretty easy, about 10 hours worth of work to pull what are voluntary separations and departures from the district. It's much harder to pull that data school by school. It takes the way the data is stored, the way you can pull it, it just takes a lot of manual effort to get there. So we weren't able to identify, well, what does that mean in terms of, because I believe that your intentions were to talk about what's turnover, not just out of the district, but what's turnover in a school building. So if we're wrong about that, let me know.
No, that is it's the building primarily that we're talking about, because of the very same things you're talking about. It leaves the individuals who are still there, in essence, constantly having to train their not train their colleagues, but in a sense train their colleagues every year in some cases.
That's right. So that's how we interpreted this. So what we weren't able to do, because the estimate was it was going to take another 10 hours to pull up that level of detail school by school. So we got half of the way there, not fully the way there. So we do think this is of high value, that we like the idea of having a specific definition of what does high turnover mean. So focusing on 15% a year, recognizing that there is a chunk of work to get to that data every year. So we want to be cognizant of what is the implementation administrative burden of that. We agree that there is that there should be a review of what are the causes of that. Where I think you're going to see the language shift here from what your proposal is, not assuming what the remedies are, right? So there were specific remedies identified, which to me predetermines before you have sat down and done the joint listening sessions, or before you've sat down and done causal analysis, it predetermines what those what those remedies might be. So, additional planning time, professional development, reduction of student loads, all of those things are things that should be on the table for discussion about what the appropriate remedies are, but they have consequences, right? And they might change from year to year, and they might change in specific circumstances. There are places where we expect to see this level of turnover because a building has changed a program, or there's been enrollment balancing, or a new school has opened, or things like that, where this might not be, where the predetermined remedies might not be appropriate. So we really want to focus on the causal analysis to lead to joint recommendations. So that's how you see the language shifts here.
Okay, may I ask
a question?
Go ahead, please do.
Okay, I just wondered, what is the difference between, voluntary separation? Like, what other types of turnover is there besides voluntary separation?
We have, so for example, we would think that a temporary teacher assignment would not count towards the turnover. If we have, I think we should talk about whether or not a retirement would be considered as part of a turnover. If there was misconduct, that's pretty unusual. We're not going to see a lot of numbers that come out of that. I don't think that's going to make a difference, but we probably wouldn't want to include. I think we know in a situation of misconduct, we're not going to fix that. I think with the school climate.
What about non-renewal?
Non-renewal, non-extension, but that would be an involuntary separation, not a voluntary separation.
And it would not count towards the high turnover. I see. Okay.
And Sharon, when you're looking at turnover, how many years back are you looking?
Oh, well, I guess we are proposing in a year. So I was anticipating that what we were talking about is a yearly review, but I think we're open to a number of different options. But I think 15% within a year makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about what's the turnover over 2 or 3 years, I think we would want to play with that number, because I don't want to overload the number of schools that we would be focusing on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to looking and researching where schools have had turnover in the last.
Yeah, we were able to do a 3-year look back. That was an annual. What was the turnover this year? What was the turnover this year? What was the turnover this year?
Okay, so 3 years. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we recommended a list of things that would be done to address most common reasons why people would say, I'm not working here anymore. May I ask, what sort of things would be mutually agreed upon? Is it, because when it's mutually agreed upon, everybody might, I can imagine every educator staying in the building saying, we think we need blank, and then the district saying, no, we don't think so. And that's that. It's not mutually agreed upon. So what sort of, what does the district have in mind in the sort of scope of agreed upon recommendations?
Well, I think the intention behind that language is to have a collaborative process, right? And the weight of the recommendations are stronger, right, when they are joint. So the concern was not predetermining what it was going to look like every time. Right. So the idea of additional planning time, professional development, or reduction in student load should certainly be on the table, but shouldn't be predetermined every time. And also, I mean, I could imagine that you could talk to a school with high turnover and you could get concerns about workload we get the same concerns about workload in a different school, right? So is it the right remedy that doesn't have high turnover, but has similar concerns, right? So if we're really narrowly focusing on what is the distinction between and the working conditions between a school that's experiencing high turnover from staff and another school, I think we'd want to narrowly tailor the remedies to what's different and contributing to that turnover. Does that answer your question, John?
I guess. I mean, I understand the idea behind it. I certainly do. I'm never against mutually agreed upon. The problem is that I can see, because the solution may be financial, and the district would say, no, we're not doing it. And so I just I am wondering whether this will get. I do appreciate the response. I get what you. It's it gives us something to think about. I'm just wondering. We had a language that was. We had language in M71 that said, okay, we're going to meet and we're going to identify these things and come up with mutually agreed upon, ways to remedy it. Basically, I'm, summarizing. And what we were doing was looking to make that actionable. So we'll think about it.
Okay.
Just to give you the reason why, I just wanted to set, so where at least my initial, not the team's, but my initial thinking on this is the idea of definitively actionable options for addressing this. So there you go.
Well, I think we certainly would not want to be making recommendations that weren't actionable, right? So hopefully that would be incorporated. I'm certainly not interested in wasting my time on recommendations that have no impact. So I hear what you're saying, and I also think that if we're going to engage in this work, then we wouldn't want it to be meaningful and meaningful recommendations and actions.
Okay.
And just one more thing I wanted to put out there. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the statewide report cards, which include a data point on teacher retention. And this is, I just linked to the most recent one from ODE, which was put out in November. And it lists the average teacher retention rate for each school. And it's pretty telling. I mean, I know that might not be quite as accurate as a point in terms of distinguishing between retirements and other reasons why people leave schools. But that data is already there, and it is very interesting and telling how different the average teacher retention rate is from school to school within PPS. For example, like just scrolling through, George has a retention rate is listed as 71%, and the next school down, Glencoe Elementary, has 92%. So there's a big differential from school to school.
Gotcha. Thank you for this.
Hey, John, one thing I was thinking of when you were talking about actionable, remedies, I don't know if you have any concern about getting to a point where we've got different schools in the district with significantly different core kind of work conditions, like amounts of prep time and things like that. It seems like you would want to go wade into that pretty carefully. Just, the contract kind of provides those baseline amounts. And so I think you would want to look pretty carefully before I think what you wouldn't want to create is separate and distinct core working conditions in too many different places within the district. I mean, and it's kind of that fine line, right? Because you want to target solutions to address a very defined problem. So I'm not saying you wouldn't do those things. I think you just don't want to end up with multiple different kind of collective bargaining agreements, school by school.
Correct. Agreed. Yeah, it's one of the odd things about, Brian, you have a much better sense of this than I do. We have this contract exception process in Portland, Is it, do you deal with that in a lot of your districts? I had not before I came to the West Coast. I had not seen it.
It's not quite as common. I mean, the sheer size and of this district and how different, things are, across the district probably lends itself a little bit to that.
Right. I think so. It took me a while to get to the point, like, wait, how many contract exceptions do we have? And is that essentially, 72 separate working conditions? Like, what are we dealing with here? But I hear what you're saying. It certainly does. You do want to have sort of a common understanding of the baseline of expectations, and it would be odd to stray from that too far for no reason at all. So yeah, I hear you.
Thanks. Other questions on that topic? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, Lisa, what's next for us?
Let's see. So I want to see if Sean is available because he was going to lead us through our next topics. Actually, Kathleen, you were going to go first. So where we'd like to turn to next is, John, you and I talked about how we have a fully prepared counter for PAT's proposals on to attract and retain educators of color. We wanted to have for some of those areas, we wanted to have the leaders for example, you had a proposal about mentors, right? And so we've asked Dr. Kimberly Mateer, who leads our mentor program, to come in later this afternoon to walk us through our counter in that area, because she's the one who really has the subject matter expertise about how that program works within our district. So I think there's 2 or 3 provisions that we'd like to hold till the afternoon when we have people scheduled to come in and help walk us through them. But we are prepared to talk about our response on the proposal regarding affinity groups and the 2 provisions about DLI. And so I'm trying to find our document so I can screen share. Just give me 1 second. And I think just as a preliminary matter, this is another area where we share a lot of the same interests. And so as I met with our leaders in the district that oversee certain areas that were touched by this language, they were very excited to see that we are jointly working towards how to attract, retain, recruit educators of color. It's definitely a focus area for us. So, Kathleen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Yes. So obviously, we recognize the importance of affinity groups for our students, and what we also want to make sure, we want to recognize that time and the time spent leading those groups and supporting those groups and supporting the students. However, we also want to make sure that the right people are leading the affinity groups, and as much as possible actually match the student population that they are serving. Because as I've mentioned a number of times, there is ample research out there that if you have the wrong person doing any type of racial equity work or affinity group work, it can actually perpetuate harm. And so we want to make sure that as much as possible, the affinity group providers mirror the affinity population of students, and that in order to facilitate the group, the provider either is provided with a release period or receives the compensation.
And I would just add that the reason for striking the extended responsibility percentage, as you can see, it's not that we don't agree that this work should be compensated. It's that we've shared, we have an agreement, informal, that we're going to be working on the extended responsibility table. And we both sides have acknowledged that we think that there are issues with that. And so So our thought process was maybe we don't add something new right now. We're going to be working on that in the fall, but we focus on immediately making sure that this work is compensated.
Can I ask a question about that? Does that include compensation for the planning and preparation that goes into the affinity groups?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know that we talked through that as a group, and so I don't know if Sean, Kathleen, if you have an immediately available answer for that, or if we'd want to chat through it.
I can speak to experience. My most recent experience being at Roseway Heights Middle School when I was principal there. Typically, our folks facilitated the groups and created an open space for students to connect and plan and do other activities. But when there were specific things that did require planning or additional legwork, we were paying our teacher volunteers through Title I funds or equity funding. So it was different. It varied based on groups as to whether it was more of a facilitated space or more of a group that was actually planning events and things of that nature. So it just varied from group to group. And in a couple of situations, we had educators were being funded for our SUN program through Portland Parks and Recreation. And it was actually added to the after school SUN programming so that students could receive transportation home and weren't using their lunchtime for that opportunity, and the teacher wasn't using their lunchtime for that opportunity. So again, it varied from group to group and the types of activities that they were choosing to do.
Yeah, I just want to add to that Charity's question, because I think educators who I have talked to who lead affinity groups, it does involve planning and responding. And I also just want to point out that a lot of times when teachers are leading affinity groups, they become a support person for those students or a point person for issues that are coming up. And so in addition to just like sitting down and planning, what are we going to do at the next affinity group, there'll frequently be requests and concerns coming into that educator all the time, right? So I think some of our thinking behind the differential was just to acknowledge it's not just a place you go for an hour to your affinity group as the educator leading it. It's a role, it's a support role that you're taking on, and it's a crucial support role for the students that we have, said that we're centering. And so I just add that to for you guys to bring back is how can you acknowledge the ongoing work that it takes to do to support an affinity group well.
Elizabeth, can I ask you a question? Have you guys collected much in the way of kind of organized or shareable data on what folks feel like they're spending time wise? That'd be really interesting to see. What amounts of time people have been putting in, and it probably varies, I'm sure, but I would be curious to see that,
Well, Bren, that's a great question. And so we don't have data, and it is my understanding that there is no district-wide program for affinity groups. So what is happening is individual schools and individual educators scrapping these together. So they're different in every place. And what we're asking for is to intentionally build affinity spaces for students that the district is supporting.
And that's what I was going to say, Brian, because of issues that came up related to it, I had one educator who was running one of these groups every single day during lunch period, during a student lunch, offering you. So it was 5 days a week for 30 minutes a day. And, then the activities that they would plan on would be additional time. But that was one example. There was another one that was doing in the afternoon twice a week. So it's really was, as Elizabeth says, it's whatever the educator. Almost every building has educators doing some of this work, and they're all doing it with what they believe they can manage to do, and they're doing it without guidance. They're basically just trying to help students.
Sure.
So that's what I think where the sort of purposeful approach to this is, as Elizabeth mentioned, is what we're after.
Yeah, I can't remember when you guys presented this originally, if the 5% and then the 10%, if that was tied back to anything like you had done some information
No.
gathering about amount of time, so that felt like maybe that 5% was right. So I just was not remembering whether you had talked about where the numbers came from.
We were looking at I can't speak for every person who helped come up with that number, but it was the size of the district, the overall cost of the compensation to on a district school-wide budget, not school-wide, excuse me, a district-wide budget.
Right.
What could actually be reason, none of this is free. I'm sure if wherever she is, Claire's hair is curling as I say these things.
She can
But,
feel talk about money. That's right.
Right. What could the district afford, so to speak? We were trying to come up with what we thought was both a fair to both sides number. So the 5% was that version of it. Like, how much per year would a person want? What is that tied to in some kind of way? And how would we express it? So that's the way we came with it.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for that.
It is not scientifically arranged or arrived at.
Got it. Thanks.
May I ask a question about the strike through of the provision for a certain number of groups per building? So what was the thinking behind taking out that part of our proposal?
I mean, I can speak to that. I mean, I have a wide variety of students represented in different schools. And so some schools, for example, when I was at Roseway Heights, I definitely had the need for multiple groups that would represent my students and give them opportunities to be in safe spaces. Whereas at Irvington, for example, when I was principal there, the need wasn't as great. And so there were different demographics for different schools, and representing both the Lincoln and Franklin cluster, I certainly see that variation. So I would honestly see in some schools you might need more than 4 groups, depending on the student population, whereas in other schools you might need fewer. Because it's not just about offering the groups; it's also getting the students interested in the groups and gaining their participation, and not just having them. There has to be the student involvement and the student buy-in also. So I do believe it varies from school to school.
We agree. We were looking for a minimum to try and meet as many students' needs as possible and to give the district a sense of budgetary guidelines. We absolutely agree. You can't compel students to attend. So the idea, we did not mean to say that a district needed to have, or a building needed to have, an affinity group that no student was coming to, just to meet the minimum number. And we did list them as at least. We agree with you completely. There are some buildings that will need more than 2 or more than 4, and there are some schools that may not have students show up and therefore would have less than, but at least they would allocate those positions. Whether they continued, who knows?
And I would also add that the students I'm most concerned about are smaller groups of BIPOC students who are in primarily white schools. And I'm thinking primarily of schools I have on the west side, where there are limited numbers of students who might affiliate with a particular group, a racial or ethnic group or religious group. And so I also think that as a collective, we could be really creative together. Now that we're used to using this virtual medium, there might be a way to actually have some combined student groups, perhaps, because I feel like it's even more difficult for those students when they're such a small number and there are so few services. There isn't Title I funding, there isn't this, there isn't that. And so in order to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our students, I do feel that collectively we can use, virtual space or other creative strategies to try to make sure those students aren't feeling isolated and alone in those schools. So that would be another example where one group might actually encompass, 4 schools with a teacher leader or a teacher facilitator. Again, I'm just brainstorming out loud, just thinking of the specific schools that I serve.
And I will say one piece of that is that takes away the component of having someone in your building that is your touch point, right? Like that relationship and that presence every day. When you see them in the hall, you see them in the office, you're like, okay, there's my person.
I totally agree with that. But for example, I had 2 students who were Rohingya at Roseway Heights who had very different experience than my African American students and other Black immigrant refugee students that were at my school, who would have loved to have had the opportunity to connect with others who had that shared not only experience but that shared cultural background. So I'm thinking a great model is IRCO, for example, because they do have a lot of subgroups, ethnicities, and religions represented, and facilitators to help with that. So it could be a similar type model because we do have at some of our schools very small numbers of students. And even within those small numbers of students, not every student might be interested in participating. So perhaps it could be a combination of combined groups with somebody who is, kind of that person who has built a relationship with them and is supportive of that process.
So there's a lot go ahead.
I have a question around the funding dedicated expressly for the purpose of affinity groups. You had mentioned that in your experience, you'd used Title I funding, you'd accessed Sun Center funding. What happens in a place where those external resources are not available? How do we ensure that there is money to fund this in every location without putting affinity groups in competition with other building level budgetary demands?
So I can only speak to the school that I supervised at the time, Roseway Heights Middle School. But first of all, I was only able to use Title I funding and equity funding because it fit my school goals. Affinity groups were specifically part of our goals in our SIP plan or in our SKIP plan. But I'm not the holder of the money. So when I was at a school that did not have Title I funds or equity funds, such as Irvington, I sought out community partner support. And that's how I was able to help provide the affinity groups, was to bring community partners. But as I said, I don't hold the purse strings.
Yeah.
So someone else might be able to answer that more fully.
Well, as I look at this, I can see that there are a lot of things we agree on. The idea that it's voluntary and that there is some administrative approval to it. The idea that the educators should try and mirror the affinity population that they're serving or centering. I realize that rather than a base of compensation at the percentage of the salary, their hourly rate might get really expensive in some cases, but if that's the district's approach to it, that's the district's approach. That's fine. I think we just have to talk about how the buildings if we're not doing a sort of minimum number that will exist, we would need to talk about how these mutually are determined, what groups, between staff and administration in the building believe that there's some kind of a how do they mutually agree upon the need that has to be met. So, but I see a lot that we have, to work with for both sides. So that's good.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen, for speaking on that one also. And I agree with you, John. I mean, I think we do have some real similar interests here. So interested to hear your group's suggestions back after you have a chance to talk about it. All right. I mean, we've got number 2 up there already. So I think, Sean, you were going to talk about our kind of first take here on the stipend.
Yeah, so we absolutely agree that teachers who are teaching in DLI programs are expected to, they do have additional responsibilities in terms of translating materials, and so we want to recognize that, and we agree that with a stipend of $3,000 for those teachers in the dual language program. I think the other things are, it's harder. A teacher is very straightforward. We know that Francisca has shared with us, for example, many times about the amount of extra time she has to spend in order to serve her students. It's clear. She's teaching a language other than English, so that's very clear and straightforward. The other educators in the building who are using their bilingual skills. It's much harder to quantify that. How often are they doing it? How are they fully fluent in the language? You know, we know a teacher is fluent in the language and has, you know, certain teacher certification. So that's why we want to limit it at this time to teachers in the DLI program. Because there's definitely a documented need for this, and also, you know, there's demonstrated proficiency in the language.
And I would maybe add on to what Sean's saying, because I've been involved in bargaining kind of related stipends, and so I was sort of doing a review of where else have we had bilingual stipends come into play. This tracks pretty closely the Hillsborough model. They call it DLP instead of DLI, and their stipend I think is right around $2,000 as opposed to $3,000. So that's one that I found. We have it is, like Sean talked about, it is harder to capture a bilingual stipend when we're talking about, you know, folks who are not necessarily in a bilingual required position. And so I understand kind of the lens that you brought with regularly asked to use bilingualism in the performance of their regular job duties. But as Sean said, that one becomes difficult to cost and to determine, because it's a little bit of a hazy standard. The regularly could mean different things to different people, right? So it was trying to get a handle on what can we concretely determine, you know, and both from a costing standpoint and who's eligible. And so the DLI, we've talked a lot about the extra demands on DLI. So our thought was the stipend, it reflects not just the bilingual skill, but also the additional time and complexity as well.
Okay. There is 18.6.2.4, which says that the district has the ability to say this building, not just DLI, but this building has a need for a particular need for bilingualism, and therefore we're going for an exception to the unassignment process. And, you know, I mean, we're talking about something very similar, and I understand you're saying this is not, you know, just as an initial response. We're thinking people in those circumstances are oftentimes counselors, social workers. There are all sorts of positions that are of specific need, and the individuals are selected for the building because of their bilingual capacity, and then therefore are oftentimes protected from unassignment, appropriately so, because of that bilingual capacity. Those are the individuals we're talking about in this circumstance. And the district has a way already to determine whether or not an individual has a bilingual capacity. We're not sure that it's really the best one, but it already has one in place.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to, we have ELL teachers that are providing instruction in English to students, but all of their communication with home and family is in another language. Like that's, I mean, that's we heard from one member who does 70% of her home contact is in another language. Like that skill, we just feel like that skill needs to be recognized and honored. That's a skill that not all of us have. It's a skill that they're bringing to PPS and providing to students and families in a way that many can't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a skill that PPS is actively recruiting, right, to find people who have it, because I think we all recognize how valuable it is. And it absolutely comes with additional work when you're in that position, making sure that families and students can access all of the things that are coming to us in English from the district, through the curriculum. It's a huge role, and it's an important role. And I think, you know, our DLI programs we have talked a lot about them. I'm glad we're talking about them. We need to keep talking about it, but I just want to reiterate, we have multilingual students and families at all of our schools. And DLI is not going to, we're not going to have a DLI program for every student and family whose first language is not English. And I don't know that that would be, you know, a realistic or beneficial model. So we know the district shares the interest in serving our multilingual families at every school, not just in our DLI programs.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last sentiment. And again, just, you know, my experience in bargaining this elsewhere, the challenge is always, if we're not talking about positions that are literally have a bilingual required on the job description or job posting, the challenge is always trying to get your arms around who exactly are we talking about, how many folks are we talking about, because, you know, obviously the districts, they need to know what kind of a financial obligation are we incurring based on what we agreed to. So getting some notion of, and that can be tough sometimes to get that kind of an estimate. So that's definitely one of the challenges that I've had in bargaining this topic in general.
And I also think when we're talking about, like, when the sense about educators who are asked to perform additional duties to assist with building translation needs, if it's things like letters that go home, I know that teachers are sometimes, employees are sometimes asked to do that, but we have translation services, so we need to be utilizing those services rather than asking. I mean, we need to make sure our principals know that you shouldn't be asking employees at buildings to translate things when we have translation services to do that. This really was our intention here, was just focused on teachers, classroom teachers that we know are doing kind of the double the work. But you wouldn't, for example, give this to a world language teacher, a Spanish teacher that teaches all day in Spanish, and then they're speaking, you know, they're speaking English, but that's a foreign language class. It's different than dual immersion, which is doing both English and Spanish, for example.
So if it sounded as though if a person's job description or has bilingualism in it, that would qualify them for the stipend, or is it only if they are teaching DLI?
And that confusion is probably on me. I think our proposal, as you see it here, is limited to the DLI program. I think when I was talking about jobs that have a bilingual required component, that's how some other districts have tried to have guideposts around who gets the bilingual stipend. There's some districts have a wide variety of jobs that are specifically listed as bilingual required. They might have like a home to school contact, or they just bargained a bilingual provision for Willamette ESD, and they had a variety of positions that are specifically identified as bilingual required, as opposed to preferred or something. And so that was our guidepost there, because it was definable, identifiable, and they had quite a few of them.
Yeah, and so I think it's just really important to our team that we're thinking, I mean, yes, about our DLI teachers, of course, but also about our social workers, our counselors, our student language our speech language pathologists, our school psychs, folks whose jobs have a huge component of communicating with families, and that we know bilingualism is a huge asset to the district. It's asked about in hiring. I believe it's last I checked, a question that's asked on applications. As far as I understand, it has been explained to people as a part of their job would be to utilize that language and in doing their job duties, and what a benefit it is to have that second language to be able to better reach our families. And so just want to make sure that you guys are clear that our intention is to be inclusive of more than just classroom teachers in this language. I mean, that was our intention, and it continues to be our interest.
Yeah, I definitely hear that coming across loud and clear. So understand where you're coming from there. And it is certainly a desirable skill. You know, I think we were looking, right now we don't have anything in this realm. So we were admittedly kind of building on a more limited scale than what you were proposing as a starting point. But we'll definitely take those thoughts back in our caucus and have some discussion about them. I do understand what you're saying. And I also know that districts are in competition for people who bring those bilingual skills, certainly. most contracts that
there's a practical, oh, I'm sorry, Brian, go ahead.
I was just going to say most contracts that have a bilingual stipend also have some notion of an internal assessment of bilingualism. John, I think you've referenced a couple of times a test, and was that the right test or an appropriate test? And I don't remember exactly if it's ACTFL or what the one is that PPS is using. Looks a little different from district to district, but almost all of them have this notion that bilingualism means more than just conversational ability in a second language. You know, true bilingualism, the ability to read and write in a second language and have a real in-depth ability to, in those regards, gets measured somehow.
Right.
And it's not in this language. I mean, I think Sean talked about the fact that we assume that for folks who are teaching in our DLI program. But other districts that have a more expansive bilingual stipend have a mention of some internal assessment mechanism. Sorry, Sharon, go ahead.
I mean, I would just add that there's I hear the interest here, and I think that there's a ton of value to our students and our school communities when it comes to bilingualism and multilingualism. I think we do have an interest in identifying, well, how should that translate into compensation? How do we how are we attracting and retaining employees with those skills? And I also think there's also a runway to really review that, set that up, that there's issues around job descriptions, there's issues around minimum quals, and over a large number of positions and types in school communities. So I think there's like, what are we ready to do right now? What do we think we could implement and we understand? And then what is a longer haul to really understand, review and have some solutions that we would be ready to implement. So there's a practical piece here under our timeline that we also need to be cognizant of, that was at least part of the discussion on our team. So I just want to put that in the room.
Okay. Anything else from our side?
I do have one. I suppose I'm not on your side, although I feel like I am sometimes. So I just found an error here. I meant to put a comment that I'm still working on trying to understand the impacts and like what our abilities are here. And I think I'm not as familiar with the term target language, and so I was hoping that y'all could explain what that means to you. And maybe I just skipped ahead. I'm not sure.
No, yes, you did, but that's okay. So this next proposal that we made had to do with the scope of the district's translated materials. And so if there's a particular language spoken at home, we're not just talking about the core language, the core subject, but then also materials and all the other subjects that have to be taught as well. Although we appreciate the efforts, and we really did as a team talk about like, well, looks like they were really translating. Certainly during the, as much as possible, there was a gigantic push by the district, it appeared, to translate as much as could be done during CDL. But as we said, that was in the core language. And so if there is language if there's material that's being translated in for the core languages, when information has to go home, that is curriculum based and that sort of stuff, it should be provided in that as well.
So, but Lisa, you're asking exactly what target language means?
Yeah, sort of. I guess I know I hear us use different phrases,
yes.
Language of instruction, target language, yeah,
well,
and so I just didn't know how they all overlap.
Yeah, so in the DLI schools, target language means the target language at SCAD is Spanish. So
Okay,
that would be the target language that is being intentionally teach at different DLI schools. That's what it means.
The language, yes, that makes sense. Okay.
So
I think there was,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think there was also discussion around the idea that like when there's, if we are wanting to invite our families in and include our families, and then we approve, the district approves like information or flyers or camp stuff to go home, and then they send it home in English, then that's not inviting or including families that don't speak English to be a part of programs that PPS is approving and supporting.
So current state is that the district has 6 supported languages. So every time we communicate to families across the district, that is generated in 6 languages. And what I see in this, in that sentence is that basically we would be expanding the number of supported languages. So every time we send out a district-wide communication to families, we would be also translating it into Japanese, right? Which is currently not a supported language, but it is a target language in the Japanese immersion program at Richmond. Is that the intention of the association with regard to that? And I would add, as you're contemplating that question, I would add that, you know, schools can ask for additional translation support resources that are specific to their communities, and that happens through our translation services team, I think, every day. So I'm trying to understand sort of what the intention is about expanding the number of supported languages we have.
So that is my understanding, because this is the issue. We don't have a control amount of communication that comes from PPS. I don't know who controls it, but sometimes at SCAD, we will receive information that needs to be sent home, and that is all in English only. So, and we are like, this needs to go home today. And then what happens is that we, DLI teachers, get parents' calls. What do you mean by this?
Right. And Francisca's internet just not totally out, but momentarily. But I think you hear her, the basis of her response.
And home from the district about the dyslexia as screening or whatever the district was doing. And then parents were like, does my child have dyslexia? What am I supposed to do with this? And I was like, I don't know. It's coming from the district. So that's why we're talking, like, any information that is important according to our district, it needs to be go to our families. It has to be in the target language, in the languages that Japanese, whatever the languages that we're supporting, at least. That's the point that we're trying to communicate.
Yep, and I'll add, the reality of accessing translation services takes time. And so when there isn't time, the responsibility falls on the educators to do the translation. And that is problematic, and that's not the way it should be. It's adding to their workload and taking them away from other tasks.
And I guess last but not least, you know, curriculum is, I see the note from Lisa, which is a good question. You know, curriculum adoptions is a question that basically is already required teacher input, true, but not intentional DLI program input. And what that leads to is sometimes selections are made for good reasons for one program, but that totally overlook the need of the DLI program, so that, adoptions come in that don't have any translated material for the educator. They might have a, slim packet of things for the students that can be purchased for additional money, but what about support for the educator in that language? So, that's where we're coming from with this, is that it is a sort of, in addition to the concept, is that when the district is looking at curriculum adoption, that it actually says, wait a minute, do we have the DLI program represented in this selection? And I hope, Lisa, I hope that gets to, which, Lisa, you might have been capturing the group's question, but whatever the case may
that one
be.
might have been specifically mine, but that does make that does make sense. I understand what you're saying.
And I think you could speak to Kelly, and probably, to be honest with you, to Richmond, and talk to the teachers there and get a sense of the level of difficulty and frustration of having to. And you've heard Francisca speak about it eloquently, about the, it's one thing to get a handout, it's another thing to get a sense from, why was this handout produced? What is the purpose of it? How do I use it with the students? What are some of the best practices? And if that's in the teacher's guide, and the teacher's guide is not in the target language, that proposes an additional workload for those folks.
All right, well, it sounds like no additional questions on this one. I don't know, district folks, anything else to add on this? Not hearing anything. Where do we want to move next?
Well, we should probably, as a team, this may be a time to break. Do you have other things that you're to share with us this morning at this point? I mean, I don't mean to dictate that this is the time to break.
No, I mean, I think that makes sense, and that's fine. I think other items that we have to share, we have some folks who are going to be coming in to speak on them. And so, Lisa, can you remind me what the schedule is on that?
Yes. I have scheduled Dr. Matier and Loretta Benjamin Samuels to join us at 2 p.m. And then Danny Ledesma is scheduled to join us at 2:30. And then I also asked that Tanya McKee, I'm really bad with this, so struggling not to mess anyone's name up, join us at 3. For any additional questions we might have about the DLI proposals that we just talked through. And she also oversees the ESL program. And I know that we had questions about how the ESL program works when we were looking at our overage proposal last week. So she's going to be able to help us get a better understanding of that.
Okay. Well, Brian, with that in mind, I know our team needs some time to be able to respond. So let's say it's 10:05. 10:45.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Sorry, can I ask a question about the DLI counter? Did you guys address our number 6 at all? Did I miss something?
So it's not, Charity, it's not our entire counter to your proposal. It's okay. So sections 1, 2, and 6 are the ones that I've asked that we're going to be responding to this afternoon once we have those people. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
No, that's fine.
So, okay.
10:45.
10:45. And of course, if for any reason we're done earlier, it's a lot of work to do, but if there's any reason to any way in which we can come back earlier, we'll let you know. And if we needed a couple of extra minutes, we'll let you know that also.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, thanks.